think this is flat wrong. I think that the Herbert thing, the argument all year to my ear was Herbert is not the most valuable person on his own team. It's Joe Alt. Because if Justin Herbert were out all year, Joe Alt can still be awesome. But Joe Alt's out, and Herbert, it's like now we're grading him on a curve. So that I flatly disagree with.
I find that particular line of reasoning to be utterly nonsensical and fundamentally dishonest, and the individual presenting it is completely aware of its lack of integrity. He is intentionally choosing to diminish the crucial impact of offensive line performance in this specific argument, which represents a staggering act of hypocrisy. This is the same commentariat that, without fail, leverages the quality of an offensive front as the primary reference point for explaining any perceived decline in Patrick Mahomes' output, or for rationalizing a defeat on the grandest stage. The blatant, self-serving inconsistency is so transparent, it's almost impressive in its audacity. The intellectual dishonesty is palpable and frustrating. I distinctly recall a specific segment, though I cannot immediately retrieve it, where this very commentator essentially proclaimed, "Observe, whenever Patrick Mahomes is afforded an offensive line he can place his confidence in, coupled with pass-catching targets of sufficient quality, he stands unchallenged as the premier quarterback in this league." He then proceeded to undertake what amounted to a comprehensive victory lap regarding this assertion. Yet, in this present circumstance, we are witnessing a deliberate contortion of logic, an attempt to propose that Justin Herbert cannot legitimately be considered the most valuable player specifically because of the overwhelming importance his offensive line holds for his personal effectiveness and his team's success. The sheer ridiculousness of this positioned argument is breathtaking. It is logically incoherent and operates in bad faith. Let us ground this discussion in the empirical reality of the past season. Justin Herbert was tasked with operating behind an offensive line that recorded a pass block win rate of precisely 54%. This figure ranked 32nd, dead last, in the entire National Football League. His offensive unit as a whole failed to produce a single All-Pro selection and likewise generated 0 Pro Bowl representatives. He was saddled with the most ineffective protective front in the sport, was provided with a depleted and wildly inconsistent group of receivers and tight ends, and could not rely on a steady ground game due to a cascade of injuries affecting that position group as well. Herbert was subjected to pressure, harassed, knocked down, and physically punished at a rate that far exceeded that of any other qualifying passer. He sustained a significant injury to his hand, a fracture, and in defiance of standard medical timelines, did not miss a single subsequent contest. And with this comprehensive, grueling body of work as the backdrop, we are apparently meant to accept the premise that he is somehow unworthy of even one solitary first-place vote for the Most Valuable Player award. Is that a serious proposition being advanced? The notion lacks all credibility. The response from the fan bases of direct rivals has been profoundly illuminating on this point. Following a video publication where I posited that Justin Herbert had been categorically robbed of legitimate consideration, the commentary section revealed a fascinating consensus. Adherents of the Kansas City Chiefs and the Denver Broncos, organizations that exist in a state of perpetual rivalry with the Chargers, found common ground. One individual, whose username explicitly and unambiguously identified him as a Chiefs supporter, contributed a remark that was particularly resonant, especially coming from a devoted advocate of Patrick Mahomes. He stated, "The MVP award is a joke. It's exclusively about final record and aggregate statistics. If it were a legitimate award evaluated on true value, Herbert would have secured it in a landslide." Herbert was, literally, the dictionary definition of the award's intent this season. There did not exist a more valuable player in the NFL. A separate comment from a Broncos fan echoed this sentiment with straightforward clarity. I find myself in complete agreement, and I am a Broncos fan. This convergence of opinion from traditionally hostile and adversarial viewpoints is not merely interesting. It is a powerful indictment of the mainstream narrative. At this juncture, I must clarify that my objective here is not to relitigate the entire MVP case through an exhaustive, minute-by-minute statistical recitation. I have articulated that particular perspective in previous venues, and I strive consciously to avoid monotonous, repetitive presentation of identical arguments. My fundamental and most pressing grievance resides in the prevailing media narrative that suggests Herbert's inclusion on even a single ballot constitutes an act of electoral insanity or profound voter error. This is the intellectual position I find utterly indefensible. We possess ample historical evidence that the award is not a pure, unadulterated function of the quarterback who accumulates the most spectacular statistics. If that were the unwavering standard, there exist specific years where one could forcefully argue that talents like Tua Tagovailoa or Baker Mayfield would possess stronger claims based purely on output. We also know incontrovertibly that it is not solely a referendum on team record. Matthew Stafford himself secured the award while leading his team to a fifth seed playoff berth. Therefore, what is the actual, consistently applied, and transparent criterion? Its conspicuous absence is the core dysfunction of the entire process. This perennial ambiguity and shifting goalpost nature of the award is precisely why, across the full duration of any given season, I maintain a degree of philosophical detachment from the eventual winner. However, the surrounding debate does serve a secondary and valuable purpose. It furnishes a structured framework for more profound, granular analysis. When an individual declares, "Player X should be the MVP," it immediately creates a conversational entry point to counter with, "Have you considered the candidacy of Justin Herbert?" which then permits a substantive, week-by-week excavation of performance metrics, situational impact, and overarching context. I can appreciate the award conversation for its utility in catalyzing these more detailed and nuanced football discussions. The award itself, in its contemporary implementation, feels increasingly arbitrary and captive to non-sporting influences. The specific argument being advanced in this instance, that it is insane Herbert received a vote, with particular scorn directed at the idea because a standout offensive lineman like Joe Alt resides on his roster, is the very epitome of a disingenuous contrarian take. This becomes especially galling when one considers a separate, lengthy, and impassioned rant from the same commentator arguing that Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills was equally undeserving of any votes whatsoever. The hypocrisy is laid completely bare for any objective observer. The contention that an individual offensive lineman, however excellent, could conceivably be more valuable to a franchise than a quarterback performing at a definitive elite level under the most adverse and hostile circumstances imaginable is not a serious, good-faith football argument. It is performance art designed to generate engagement through provocation, not through substantive analysis. The very architecture of the MVP voting process is intrinsically and deeply flawed. In a more ideal evaluative ecosystem, the distribution of first-place votes across the breadth of a season should be relatively broad, reflecting the genuine diversity of uniquely impactful performances across the league. The fact that we are even conducting a conversation expressing outrage or disbelief that a Justin Herbert or a Josh Allen managed to garner a single vote is, in and of itself, symptomatic of a broken and intellectually lazy system. The entire process remains acutely vulnerable to narrative engineering and orchestrated media campaigns, as was so visibly evidenced by the coordinated publicity blitz surrounding Matthew Stafford's family life in the immediate aftermath of his victory. The orchestrated, heartwarming footage featuring his daughters, while genuinely endearing on a human level, simultaneously revealed a deliberate and concerted push toward a specific, league-sanctioned archetype: the family man, the relatable superstar, the veteran completing a career arc. The NFL and its vast network of media partners received a tantalizing, unprecedented glimpse of crossover, mainstream cultural appeal with the omnipresent Travis Kelce-Taylor Swift phenomenon, and are now aggressively, unmistakably curating that family-friendly entertainment product image. There exists a palpable, massively amplified emphasis on showcasing players' spouses, children, and curated personal narratives. While this human element has perpetually existed around the sport's periphery, its current scale and strategic deployment as a central marketing pillar are unprecedented. For consumers such as myself, who remain primarily and passionately invested in the athletic excellence, strategic complexity, and brutal beauty of the sport itself, this ancillary, personality-driven focus can feel exhausting, irrelevant, and a distraction from the core product. More damagingly, it actively corrupts an award that should be centered purely and uncompromisingly on demonstrable, on-field value and indispensable contribution to team success. This flawed electoral process is further exacerbated by the practical, logistical reality of voter preparation and due diligence. I remain highly skeptical that the majority of individuals bestowed with a vote possess the necessary time, mandate, or institutional support to conduct a thorough, film-intensive, contextual evaluation of every leading candidate's complete season portfolio. To execute this duty properly, akin to the process undertaken by television broadcast analysts when preparing for a specific team's upcoming game, would mandate watching every single offensive snap taken by each serious contender. As someone who dedicates a truly immense amount of personal effort to watching, notating, and analyzing a vast number of games each week, I can personally attest to the monumental, almost prohibitive difficulty of this task. And I do not carry the additional professional burdens of extensive cross-country travel, live television production commitments, and other obligations that many of these voters balance. The inescapable conclusion is that a significant proportion of votes are cast based on prevailing media narratives, convenient statistical shorthand, and unconscious groupthink, rather than on a comprehensive, context-aware analysis of performance and tangible impact. This concern is compounded by the modern inclusion of podcasters, digital media personalities, and other non-traditional media figures within the voting pool. If this is now the expanded, democratized criteria for electoral participation, then the gatekeeping logic becomes even more opaque and inconsistent. The common retort that certain vocal analysts are excessively biased is often a superficial dismissal. Every voter, without exception, carries their own perspective, preferences, and philosophical leanings. The essential distinction lies in self-awareness, intellectual honesty, and a demonstrable commitment to rigorous, consistent evaluation. I would forcefully argue that a deep, season-long, immersive engagement with the performance of all 32 teams, as opposed to a parachute-in approach focused solely on popular, marketable storylines, constitutes a far stronger and more legitimate qualification than many current voters appear to possess. The unspoken but potent legacy component further muddies the analytical waters. There exists an undeniable, though rarely admitted, inclination to check the box or correct a perceived historical oversight for great players who are viewed as lacking certain career-defining accolades. Matthew Stafford perfectly embodied the Hall of Fame caliber quarterback who has never won an MVP narrative. There is a sympathetic, almost romantic urge within segments of the media to rectify that omission, to furnish his career resume with that missing piece. While this impulse is understandably human, it absolutely should not function as a legitimate factor in evaluating a single season's most valuable player. The profound danger inherent in this approach is that, perhaps 8 or 10 years into the future, we might witness a lifetime achievement, or career culmination MVP award, being bestowed upon a player like Justin Herbert, in a retroactive attempt to balance the scales for a season like this most recent one, where his demonstrated value was so starkly evident, yet officially and overwhelmingly ignored by the voting body. The comprehensive dismissal of Herbert's candidacy this past season does a profound and lasting disservice to the spirit of the award and to the player's remarkable achievement. One is not required to anoint him the definitive winner, to rationally acknowledge that his performance under genuinely dire circumstances rendered him unequivocally worthy of serious, top-tier consideration and a substantial number of first-place votes. The inherent tribalism that fuels professional sports fandom need not preempt this basic, objective acknowledgement of merit from an impartial observer. We can simultaneously maintain fierce allegiances to our chosen teams and still possess the capacity to recognize transcendent, value-driven performances from athletes on rival franchises. A more mature, intellectually honest conversation would sound like, I do not believe Justin Herbert should have ultimately won the award, but his receipt of votes is completely justified, expected, and reflects his incredible season. I am genuinely surprised he did not receive a greater share of the vote total. Instead, what we are frequently presented with is a performative, dismissive stance. It's utterly ridiculous that he received a vote. This position is not merely debatable. It is fundamentally wrong and exposes the corrosive groupthink at play within the ecosystem. The enormous statistical and voting chasm between the official winner and players of Herbert's or Allen's caliber does not indicate a clear-cut, unambiguous race. Rather, it highlights a troubling consolidation of opinion around a predetermined, media-fueled narrative, not a genuine dispersal of votes based on independent, critical assessment. A final, glaring example of this inconsistent, narrative-chasing logic was the wild volatility of the in-season discourse between Drake May and Matthew Stafford. Following a subpar Stafford performance in a critical late-season game, the instantaneous media declaration was, "The MVP race is concluded. It now belongs to Drake May." Then, immediately subsequent to a statistically productive but contextually meaningless performance against a non-competitive Arizona Cardinals squad, a contest that head coach Sean McVay explicitly demanded his starters participate in purely as a matter of wounded pride, the dominant narrative performed an instantaneous, whiplash-inducing reversal back to Stafford has now locked up the MVP. The underlying rationale for this flip was nebulous, contradictory, and entirely disconnected from a coherent standard. If the award's true North is statistical supremacy, then Joe Burrow's historically elite efficiency metrics should have been the paramount consideration from the outset. But when that point is raised, the rebuttal immediately pivots to team success and playoff qualification. Yet Stafford himself was not a top seed and his team's record was not dominant. The rejoinder then becomes, but his aggregate statistics were phenomenal, which circles back to the Joe Burrow counter-argument as his statistics were similarly phenomenal, if not superior, in key efficiency categories. We inevitably spiral into these circular, self-justifying, logically inconsistent loops, with no anchoring in a stable, coherent, predefined philosophy of value. This exhausting week-to-week inconsistency in applied standards is precisely why the perpetual MVP discourse becomes so intellectually tiresome for a segment of the audience. One week, the anointed frontrunner is Baker Mayfield. The following week, it becomes Dak Prescott. Then it transforms into a definitive, Matthew Stafford has sewn it up declaration, with little substantive connective tissue beyond ephemeral media momentum and storyline appeal. If I were personally compelled to construct a legitimate ballot based strictly on a pure, unadulterated interpretation of value to one's team, I would contend the primary, first-tier conversation should have been rigorously confined to a debate among Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, and Christian McCaffrey, in some order of preference. Nuanced arguments against the inclusion of any one of those three individuals are perfectly valid and constitute the substance of meaningful debate. But to argue that they were not even worthy of a single vote in an electoral field comprising approximately 100 voters is to abandon logic, fairness, and a basic understanding of football contribution entirely. Let me be unequivocal. This is not to assert that Matthew Stafford was not excellent or that Drake May was not a legitimate, compelling candidate. He absolutely was, and I myself argued for his candidacy at an early stage based on my perception of where the narrative momentum was organically flowing. However, the cognitive dissonance required to ignore the selective application of criteria is striking. We witnessed a recent season where Brock Purdy demonstrably led the entire league in every major passing category: touchdowns, rating, completion percentage, yards, and guided his team to the NFC's top overall seed, only to be summarily dismissed from serious contention because he is surrounded by too much elite talent. Yet, in this most recent cycle, Matthew Stafford operated with the Offensive Rookie of the Year in Puka Nacua, a truly elite and cohesive offensive line, a consistently potent and diverse running game, and the strategic guidance of an elite, championship-winning head coach in Sean McVay. The criteria for disqualification based on superior supporting cast are applied in a glaringly selective and intellectually inconsistent manner. This endemic inconsistency is the primary reason I have previously suggested that a season of Stafford's phenomenal statistical output might have been more appropriately and accurately recognized with an Offensive Player of the Year award, an accolade explicitly designed to honor peak individual performance and statistical dominance, rather than the conceptually distinct and more nebulous most valuable player honor. What we desperately require as a football community is the establishment of a more rigorous, transparent, and standardized framework for what the term value actually signifies within the context of this award. Is it pure statistical dominance relative to peers? Is it the demonstrable elevation of a mediocre or flawed roster into playoff contention? Is it being the unambiguous best player on the league's best team? Is it a combination of these factors with a predefined weighting? Until the voting body and the media ecosystem collectively define the term with clarity and adhere to it with consistency, the MVP award will remain what it often appears to be: a glorified popularity contest shaped by transient narrative momentum, unspoken legacy considerations, and pervasive media groupthink, rather than a genuine, principled assessment of a player's indispensable worth to his franchise over the exhaustive grind of a 17-game season. The specific case of Justin Herbert this past season functions as the clearest, most unambiguous litmus test for the award's current integrity and the intellectual honesty of its surrounding discourse. He was, by any reasonable measure, the very embodiment of the term value. He was the sole, unequivocal reason his team remained competitive in a significant number of contests, performing at a sustained elite level despite a supporting cast and a protective scheme that actively and persistently undermined his efforts at nearly every turn. To dismiss his candidacy with flippant, contradictory, and demonstrably hypocritical logic is to reveal the award's present-day superficiality and its captivity to non-analytical forces. All serious football observers, irrespective of team allegiance or personal preference, should be capable of stepping back, setting aside tribalism, and acknowledging that his season was not merely good or impressive, but was historically significant within its specific context of adversity. He was worthy of a central place in the conversation, worthy of deep, thoughtful consideration, and unquestionably worthy of far more than a solitary, marginalized vote. The collective failure to recognize and honor that reality is not ultimately a commentary on Justin Herbert's performance. It is a glaring, damning indictment of the award's flawed electoral process and the intellectual laziness that too frequently characterizes the discourse surrounding it.